Hiya! Okay, so this is the third video of Key Area 2 of Unit 2 of National 5 Biology. Again, we're 5 videos in total for this one key area. It's quite a big one. What we've covered so far is we have looked at the structure of the central nervous system and the brain. We've looked at the 3 types of neurons and their role. We're now about to have a look at how those 3 neurons work in a particular example, and the example you need to know is the reflex arc.
And this is the final bit of nervous control. So in this video, we're going to look at the purpose of reflexes. There is a very specific purpose to them, and the order of responses in a reflex arc, which is a very, very common 4/5 mark question that you need to know.
Okay, so things you should be able to do: state what a reflex is, mainly state why we have reflexes. That occasionally crops up on exam questions. State what stimulus is, and describe the process of a reflex arc. So that maybe looking at a diagram, identifying neurons, it might be writing out an extended response question for talking about the order of events in a reflex arc.
Okay, so first of all, what are reflexes? Now, reflexes are basically our body's response to danger. So it's however you avoid being in something dangerous. Whatever you do to avoid that, it's a reflex. So if you get asked what is a reflex is your body's response to harm or danger. So a reflex protects the body from harm, basically.
Examples of reflexes include things like your pupillary reflex, so making your pupils narrower in bright light or wider in dark light, but mainly narrowing in bright light.
Gagging is a common one. Your gag reflex, you'll probably all have heard of it.
Yep, that's one that's tested for. If they think you're dead, they might try the gag reflex occasionally. The patella reflex, so that one in the knee, that's the most common one that we have a tendency to look at. And that, again, is looking at, essentially, the test for that is not how good are your muscles. What it's looking at is how good is the transmission of your neurons in your leg.
And then that final one is not a reflex. The final one is a child having terrible reflexes at saving a goal. So no.
Or just reacting really slowly, because that's not even a reflex.
Okay, so the reflex arc is what we're going to look at specifically in this video. So the reflex arc is the process in which basically that a reflex occurs. So from you getting the signal to you doing the response to avoid the danger or harm, and that process of the signal and how it travels through your body is quite similar to the process we talked about in the last video of just general neural signaling, except there's one main part that it misses out. So that's the purpose of a reflex arc. It's just showing us how a reflex occurs.
Okay, now you might want to pause it here, maybe try and label up this diagram, because quite common exam questions are identify from this diagram sensory motor or interneurons, or identify the effector or something like that.
Yeah. And there will always be directional arrows in it, so you will be able to tell what way it is going. They've been quite nice about this in the last load of years.
So if we look at the structure of a typical reflex arc, we can see we've got our interneuron that's in the middle in the central nervous system. Ignore the transverse section through the spinal cord words, the white matter, grey matter. You do not need these words. The only words that you need are the ones that are in the boxes. So what we do is we start with the receptors that are at this end here, at the start of our sensory interaction. The receptors pick up a signal that travels down the sensory neuron to the central nervous system and passes that signal to the interneuron. The interneuron then passes the signal directly to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron then sends a signal down itself to the effector, which is usually a muscle or gland, causing a contraction that helps protect you. Okay, so this is an example of a protective response, a rapid response. Now notice we did not go into the brain in this diagram anywhere. This one instead skips out the brain. The reason for this is, imagine this whole reaction is happening in, say, you have just stood on a bit of glass. You need that signal to come all the way up your leg, and if reflexes didn't exist, the signal would have to travel up to your brain and say, you have just stood on glass. Now, while that is happening, you are pressing harder and harder and harder into that glass. Instead, what happens is the signal comes up your leg to your spinal cord and then straight back down to a muscle to say move. And then a second later, your brain goes, oh, well, that was horrible and I just stood in glass. But the fact is, I took my leg away.
So most reflexes avoid the brain. Some still go to the brain because things like if dust is coming at your eye, the nearest place for that signal to go is to your brain. So it makes sense for it to go to your brain because that's the nearest part of your central nervous system there. But the majority of reflexes bypass the brain because it's just too far. It takes too long and you're just in too much danger if you take the time to go to it.
And instead what we see is just this little short loop, sensory to inter to motor, very, very quick quick, fast response.
Okay, so some key definitions about reflexes. You need to know the word stimulus. So that is the thing that actually can be sensed by an organ or tissue.
A receptor is something that can detect a stimulus.
And the effector is the organ or tissue that responds to the motor neuron signal. So in terms of the structure of the reflex arc, this is again very, very common 4 or 5 mark question. It's a really nice one to get though, because it's just a nice little story, isn't it? So the first thing that happens is your receptors must detect a sensory stimulus. The electrical impulses, like we talked about in the last video, the electrical impulses must carry that signal along the sensory neuron towards the CNS. This happens, so the signal then travels across a synapse. Remember, it goes electrical signal, and then it crosses the synapse as chemical messengers into the next neuron, which will then be the interneuron. So the electrical impulses then travel along the interneuron within the CNS. So we've gone to the CNS, we're now within the CNS. The signal is then going to go across another synapse in towards our motor neuron, and the electrical impulses will then go along the motor neuron away from the CNS, and the response will occur at the effector muscle or gland that is at the end of the motor neuron.
Okay, so again, very typical 4 or 5 mark question, if you can write it out in this order. I've seen another one which does say name the number of synapses in a reflex arc. They've given a picture though of the reflex arc, so the idea is all you had to do was count the number of gaps between neurons. So be aware that you might get asked to do that in an exam situation as well.
Yeah, and again, here's a nice wee gift just showing it. It is the classic, I put my hand on a candle, as we all often do. And what happens, you can see there's no brain involved. The signal is just going up the arm, it's going into the spinal cord, and you can see the little jolt, like a little bead of light going along it. That is that electrical signal going through it. So along the sensory, through the inter, and back along the motor to the muscle where it makes your arm pull away.
Partly we also all own candles from like the 19th century, those old-fashioned ones.
Very Beauty and the Beast-esque.
Okay, so to summarize the entire of the reflex arc, a reflex is a quick automatic response that protects the body from harm.
The reflex arc is the pathway of neurons that are involved in a reflex response.
Stimulus is something that can be sensed.
And a receptor is something that can detect a stimulus.
Okay, so things that you should be able to do is state what the reflex is.
The reflex is something that prevents the body from danger or harm.
Okay, why do we have reflexes?
To avoid danger or harm.
What's a stimulus?
A stimulus is something that basically causes the response causes a signal to be sent along your sensory neuron to say, I'm in pain.
Are you getting distracted by that GIF?
Yeah, I like the GIF. I can't help it.
And describe, let's go just for the order of events in a reflex
the whole thing. But yeah, you get a signal as a receptor. It goes sensory, intermotor to effector, response. Go back to the one where I just explained it fully if you want my full explanation of it.
Okay, so that is the end of nervous control of control and communication. Remember, control and communication, 2 big sections. First one, nervous control,
which
then
is done.
Hormonal control. So we are done with nervous control. So nervous control, what's the central nervous system? What are the types of neurons? What's a reflex? Those are the 3 main things out of nervous control that you need to know. The next section is hormonal control, so it'll be about what are hormones, what system are they part of, and also then we'll look at a specific example of blood glucose.